Welcome everybody to the third installment of & Co. Yard & Company, who's producing this, is an urban planning and development firm that is wholly focused on helping to solve problems using place and place making and helping neighborhoods and districts grow. And as such, as I'm sure many of our attendees can attest to their own work, we've been pulled into a lot of work of late in helping cities and their mixed-use districts in particular respond and rebuild coming out of the pandemic. And so after several weeks of this work, we had decided that it was a good idea to essentially create a discussion series that was a platform for sharing what we're learning, what we're seeing, and what some of the others on the leading edge of responding to this crisis are doing. So it's a platform for sharing these ideas and charting a new path forward. And what we've been really interested in is not how we get back to the old normal, but understanding that we're actually pursuing a rather new one based on some really interesting ideas. So our previous guests have included retail experts and master developers that are using public-private partnerships and other creative tools to build back their neighborhoods and their districts. My name is Joe Nickel. Kevin Wright from Yard & Company is also with us. And I'm pleased to welcome our third guest, Mike Lydon from Street Plans, with us today, and the author of the Tactical Urbanism. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Mike, the first thing we typically ask people, just because this is such a personal experience that everybody's kind of going through and everybody's kind of experiencing it in different ways, is just, how are you? Where are you? How is work happening or not happening in over the past couple months?
Yeah, thank you. We are quite fortunate, our whole family as well, and no one's become sick. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, so in the heart of the worst hit city and state and region in the country. So that's been obviously concerning from the beginning. But we've been able to make it work so far. My wife and I and our son, who's 2, we kind of set up a pretty good situation, or best as could be imagined at this time. But that's not to say that daily life in New York is not more challenging, particularly just access to playgrounds, which is not possible right now, has been challenging, as you might imagine, with a toddler. But we are using our parks as much as we can to get outside, get some exercise, and help keep him moving, our little son. Work has been interesting. I think for the most part, our projects are moving forward. Some of them on slightly different timelines, largely to account for, rejiggering some of the public engagement and how we're going to do that. So we've, gone through that exercise with a number of clients and set up a new path forward. I think for a lot of our projects, there's still an open question about how we do the implementation. A lot of our work is, designing streets and master plans and, public spaces and things like that. But a huge part of that too is also delivering those physically with community groups and with partners. So doing that in a time when we have to be physically distant is clearly an upcoming challenge. It may mean less public engagement in the exercise of building these streets. We'll see. Or may mean pivoting to some different materials or different approaches with partners and contractors in a way that we wouldn't always do. That's good. And then there's been just a huge surge of interest and demand for how to respond and how to create safer streets and public spaces that help people move around, of course, and then also be physically active. And so we're working with a number of cities and organizations right now to develop strategies, guidance, and then of course help them implement some of these changes. So it's challenging.
Well, picking up on that, and it's not uncommon to have screaming going on in the back of these calls. Just piggybacking on that last notion, Mike, I think it was you, but it could have been somebody else. But you've certainly been tracking it and have developed an excellent database of where it's taking place. But that is this notion of a COVID-19 street. Can you walk us through just a little bit of what you're seeing kind of as new patterns emerge around the COVID-19 street? What are the types? What are the ways it's being used? Who's leading the charge? What's working? What's not working?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see the surge of response in cities, and of course across North America, but globally as well. Maybe it was 2 months ago. I started to see that a lot of cities were likely to take these types of measures, and of course, it was a little bit slow at first, but it's really exploded and continues to explode. So very similar to some of the work that we've done in the past, where we kind of catalog and kind of define ways or best practices for changing our streets and public spaces. Just an opportunity to do that, only instead of tracking something over the course of years or months, we're tracking over the course of days and weeks. So I thought the best way to do this was to create this open source spreadsheet, just tweet out the link, and there's just been a huge surge of use and interest in that. And cities are finding it to be a helpful resource, and advocates are finding it to be a helpful resource to be able to point to where and how different cities are doing this globally. I think what's really interesting is that with over 200 cities now who are taking action, there's really about 6 basic types of changes that cities are making. I think there's room for more, and that will probably expand moving forward as the different lockdown and restriction measures change and evolve. But we're seeing, broadly open streets, which is closing streets to vehicles, if not for time of day, then just every day, 24/7. So that people can walk, bike, physically distance themselves while being engaged in the public realm. And that started earlier on in just streets that were within parks or along waterfronts. So these are the types of roads that are generally not serving a huge through transportation function. And were very easy to kind of clip the ends and say, all right, this is now space you can use. That then has kind of morphed over the last several weeks into focusing more on downtown commercial streets and restaurant districts. So we're really just seeing that kind of emerge now, where Cincinnati, which is your neck of the woods, and Vilnius, Lithuania was one of the first cities to do this, but Tampa Bay, Tampa, Florida, a number of places now are saying, okay, can we take the curb lane or can we take the whole street and make this more of a cafe dining situation, which will help the businesses. So that's kind of the 2 different plays on open streets. And then there's this notion of what we've been calling open curbs. So if you're not taking the whole street, then you might be altering the use of the curbside lane, which could be either parking or driving. And that can be used for, creating more space for queuing to come in inside and out of businesses and buildings. It can be used for additional space for queuing on transit. It can be used for just walking movement, like just to have more space to pass each other on narrow sidewalks. And it can be used for cafe seating and dining as restaurants begin to slowly reopen. So that's a really flexible approach that really depends on the kind of street that you have and what you're trying to achieve through that change. I guess it can also include transit lanes, although we've not yet seen that type emerge. Another type has been slow streets. That was kind of popularized by Oakland, California. They announced all at once they were not shutting down, but they're altering 74 miles of residential streets primarily to just filter traffic out. So you can drive on the block if you live there, but you're not encouraged to do that otherwise, by basically creating a soft closure on one of the lanes coming in or out of the neighborhood. So they have a bike master plan that included neighborhood greenways, which is a slow speed, shared kind of street approach to street design. And they just looked at that plan and said, okay, this is a network. Let's do this on a network level. And that has since inspired a lot of cities around the country and the globe to take a similar approach. So it's really much more about the neighborhood context and giving people additional space. I think a lot of cities too are looking at neighborhoods that don't have backyards or front yards, where that's the most important kind of response. The city of Providence did a lot of data crunching and looked at all the neighborhoods that are the highest density and have the least likelihood to have any outdoor space associated with dwelling units. And that's where they opened 13 miles of streets in this configuration to encourage people to walk, bike, skate, whatever they can do, jump rope in the middle of the street. So anyways, that's a really key change. Temporary bikeways is another one. Lots of cities are taking that on. There's this whole understanding now that, hey, if we're not using transit the same rates and more people are going to migrate towards cars and we don't have safe bike infrastructure, if we create the bike infrastructure, we might be able to keep the city moving and not completely seize up with congestion as people go back to normal. And of course, there's lots of people who are essential workers and for recreation moving around the city already who are using their bikes. And so to do that more safely, the city is creating a lot of protected bike lanes. And Paris France is definitely the leader on that one. They're basically fast tracking a regional plan that will see over 400 miles of bikeways implemented. And a lot of those bikeways are going to be kind of paralleling or on top of, let's say, the subway system, the metro system, and the commuter rail system, so that you're basically augmenting you're using the mental map of people in the Paris region who know places by their stations, right? And now you have bikeways that run along that trajectory. It allows people to really kind of map the city the way they normally would with the subway system. So that's been really interesting.
Yeah, it seems like with transit in particular, with the nervousness or uncertainty about re-engaging with transit, we've shifted from thinking about the last mile, which we always were worried about when transit wasn't, trying to confront a pandemic, to how can we actually cover like 3 miles, right? And remove those trips from the system to allow people to have a longer haul, more space on the vehicles and that kind of thing, while getting more people outside on the 2 wheels or on 2 feet.
Right, and all this is aligning with the warmest time of the year, which in some ways is convenient or helpful because people will get on their bikes. They will walk longer distances now because of the weather. So, of course, people need the space as well. If it's going to be hot, a lot of folks don't have access to air conditioning or places to cool down. We see that in a lot of cities. So being able to get outside into a shaded area is going to be really critical on the streets.
Yeah, we've been through a couple projects we're working on talking about even bringing some of the cultural assets of neighborhoods kind of outdoors to the recreation centers, which are so important for families and kids in neighborhoods in the summertime. Libraries. I think it's kind of even interesting to think about how you could approach this in neighborhoods that have never had assets like that and bring those to the neighborhood in a mobile way, which is maybe something we should have been doing before all this.
Yeah.
And your work and our work is similar in some ways, in the sense that when we do our master planning work for downtowns, we tend to test this sort of thing in real time as part of our engagement protocol, and sort of test its usability in real time demand to inform the longer term recommendations within the master plan. A couple projects we're working on now, it's kind of interesting. It's totally reshaping the outcomes and goals of our master plan work. And I guess what's exciting for us is that the stuff that we're designing is actually not temporary. It's semi-permanent because of COVID. How do you see this affecting, like, to think about it in terms of the next 12, 24, and even 3+ years? Is there anything people can be doing or thinking about to ensure that some of this never gets removed?
Yeah, I think it's monitoring and evaluation and being transparent with the public about what is working, what is not, and having people able to weigh in. If you're not kind of engaging in that conversation, it's going to be relatively difficult, I think, in many places, to take what seems like an emergency measure with orange cones and transform that into something that's more long lasting, particularly as, some semblance of the old normal gets blended with the new normal. There's still going to be people who are concerned about those types of changes. So I think really understanding where there's demand and where things are working and be able to prove that out is going to be essential for the longer term. I think also being quickly able to pivot to more interim materials. So maybe not curb and concrete and permanent trees and landscaping, but to, the paint and some form of removable installable bollard in terms of protection. Like that kind of, quick build toolkit is essential to take it from what a lot of people find to be a construction zone kind of aesthetic to something that's more beautiful and functional and can better represent cultures and places and what people want to see, in their neighborhoods from a placemaking perspective. So those are like a couple things. It's, I think it's going to be really important that cities are transparent about how and why they're doing this. And then, of course, aligning this work with existing policies or plans that have already been vetted or adopted by the community and the public, that gives them a leg to stand upon and thinking about the next steps with some of these projects and saying that this is really consistent with our climate policy. We've been trying to get less air pollution, and wow, we just have 50% reduction almost overnight. Like, what can we keep as part of this? And I think communicating that opportunity to people is really important at this time too.
Yeah, I think part of that I'm kind of interested in as I learn more details about how it's being approached in different places and what isn't working is on the legal side, where you're seeing some cities basically give over the street to the private entities, either the restaurants and retail and bars themselves or the district management entities, to avoid insurance claims or injury, things like that, versus keeping control, managing it themselves. I feel like the legal structure is going to speak to the ability to keep it around longer. So it's kind of something to keep an eye on. I don't know if you're seeing anything there.
Yeah, I mean, it varies from place to place. And of course, cities have their own understanding of risk. I think cities and communities have done temporary activation or seasonal or time of day activations over the course of many years, have a bit more of a muscle for this. And I think by trying things now in a very temporary way, I can and gauge how the public is responding. And we've seen very little response from the public in terms of being inappropriate behavior or people gathering too closely or having big parties in the street. That's like just not the vibe right now. And so I think there is a risk that gets turned up a little bit as things turn back on in the economy. But for the most part, cities are seeing that they can trust their citizens at this point. I think developing that level of trust is critical. I think on the flip side, the quote unquote privatizing of the public space is a real issue that, communities are debating the merits of letting a bid, manage more and more of the open and available space. And while I understand that critique through a number of lenses, I think at this time, the biggest thing that you can do, whether it's the city or it's the bid leading the way, can kind of set forth some sort of measure or proclamation or legal structure that, hey, this might sunset in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. However, managers will revisit it based on how it goes. So you're not 100% committing to rejiggering how the public realm is managed legally and then, of course, physically from the public realm side. So it's, there's a lot to be worked out there. And it's interesting how different cities are using various, mayoral proclamations, declarations of emergency, councils, taking, the path that they rarely have ever used before to kind of put a whole package together from a legal perspective that is in an emergency setting. And that emergency setting will come down over time. But for now, an initial response, that's one of the key tools that cities have been using.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act. I think there are some things that you can say to restaurants or retailers and give them a toolkit of sorts that says, here's what you can just go do, build a parklet, tape off the ground, put vinyl signs on the concrete. I think there's a real risk to, at least in a dense mixed use district, of just saying, hey, everybody for themselves. I think there has to be somebody waking up every day, managing the different restaurants, or chaos will ensue. And really thinking about the difference between how to use surface parking lots or even parking garage rooftops versus alleyways and sidewalks and streets themselves.
Yeah, there's a whole range of these space types, which are all managed in a variety of ways. I think you're right. Particularly, let's talk about the mixed-use Main Street environment. It doesn't really make a lot of sense the way that at this scale in this moment, the way we've done things in the past, which is, okay, business A really wants to take one parking space away and put in, 4 or 5 cafe chairs. Like that's been fine in the past as a one-off, but I think for this to work on a more district level, you've got to think about the whole block. And that means coordinating more. It's not just, hey, we're going to take the one parking space in front of the one business and transform that into something else. It's we need to think about a little bit more linear space along, at least at the small scale, a single block. And that might mean coordinating with the barbershop, and might mean, coordinating with the insurance agent who has a ground floor, office space. It might mean coordinating with, a variety of different types of restaurants that are open at different times of the day. And so that's going to be a little bit complex, I think, to start. But the starting point for negotiation and proposal right now is at least a baseline that a lot of people, I think, can appeal to their better selves and say, okay, this is a little bit bigger than my own individual business in some ways. We have got to think differently about our spaces right now to just survive economically. And I think that's going to be the biggest driving factor in mixed use environments for the next, 12 to 18 months. It's just survival.
Yeah.
Yeah. On that note, one thing that we're always wrestling with, and I'd like to kind of touch on some of the thoughts you've had around engagement during this time. I get the sense, and we have certainly been part of it in some cases, that this is don't let any crisis go to waste. This is a great time to advance some of those plans and agendas that we've all had that are, based on the goals that we all generally agree on. But in a lot of places that we're working, that there's a sense that there's two tracks. There's the track that the government guidance is going on and opening back up America or opening up parts of the economy again. And then there's what business owners, customers, employees at those businesses actually feel comfortable with.
Right.
That can mean a lot of different things based on where you're at. What have you seen in your observations and your work of late where, whether it's happening at a district level or even down to a pocket park associated with a single operator or business, ways in which companies and businesses are, or district managers are really doing a good job at addressing that latter concern of that feeling of safety. If I don't feel safe coming to a district, or if I feel like I can't get there safely, I'm not going to go back out there. Have you seen anything that is particularly useful in terms of engaging that business owner and then thinking about, okay, what do we do here so that everybody can be successful and healthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a great answer or response to that. I'm kind of starting to see just in the last couple of weeks how the retail environments and restaurant, mixed use environments are thinking about the full street and how to respond to that. And so if there is, of course, room for the 6 feet, I think it allows for people to feel generally more comfortable. But that's such an individual thing that you might find a restaurant owner is comfortable opening up, but then they have a hard time getting employees to come in. Or what happens when things swing back and we might have, a spike in cases again in a certain region or in a city that might make the worker or the restaurateur who's comfortable today not comfortable tomorrow. So I think what's really important with a lot of these different measures right now is to be really flexible, be really open to, we're open today, we might not be open tomorrow. And this is going to be a day-to-day kind of thing. Governments can set their benchmarks and their criteria. But even so, that we don't know if that's totally aligned with the market, right? It might not make sense for a restaurant to reopen if they can only take the curb lane for cafe seating and space to serve customers. It may only make sense if they can take the whole street. If the city doesn't allow the whole street, then the restaurant is not going to open. It won't make economic sense for them. So those dynamics are such a granular level, and I think we're just starting to see how they might play out. Just before we got on this phone call, I was kind of catching up with some of the cities and what they're doing. And Winter Park, Florida, which is just outside of Orlando, did a closure to traffic of one of their main streets over Mother's Day weekend. And they allowed more than 400 businesses to apply to be able to use the public realm, to use the street and the sidewalk in a different way to help them economically and to allow people to walk on the street and feel like their city is starting to come back. And they had 22 businesses out of 400 respond. So that's better than 2.
Yeah.
But it's still relatively low.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side, what we're hearing as one of the concerns is that city A puts in all the effort to create that environment, convinces whether it's 222 or 202 businesses to scale back up, hire back up if they had to furlough employees, buy new food and stock, get it prepared, get it ready to come to market, and then the sun comes up and nobody shows up. And so you've taken a business that's on the very fragile, and you've maybe given them one last shot and it didn't work out. And so I think what we're seeing is this idea, this doubling down need of being empathetic and understanding what individual businesses need, and then pairing that with really agile responses.
Right. I agree. I mean, it has to go both directions. We have to be comfortable with the fact that in July, in November, next March, things are getting worse again. And so, insofar that cities get comfortable with the cones and the signs, and they want to move on, they might get comfortable with that again. Or the fact that restaurants open and have to close again. Like, this is something that we might have to deal with. It may not be countrywide all at once moving forward at some point, but it might be regional or city by city. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're even going to get to an environment it's hard to imagine a time when testing and tracing actually catches up, but we will get there. Where even at a city level, you're going to have districts that are green lighted and districts that are orange and yellow, and people will be able to make choices about how they spend their time and money based on that, which underscores, you know, all these environmental things in addition to smart policy that we have to be creating. And it speaks to the power of agility and tactical urbanism, this ability to apportion spaces and learn, and in some cases go backwards when cases spike. It's always been a relevant endeavor, tactical urbanism, but now it's got a whole new use that I think was kind of bubbling beneath the surface. Now you're seeing businesses who never even thought of themselves as urbanists and as you know, trial and testers, you know, innovating in the public realm. It's really exciting to watch. So we only got a couple minutes left. We try to keep these to 30 minutes. And I think that's a pretty good segue to just some closing thoughts from you, Mike, about, you know, if you've had a chance to pause and kind of look back, take a step back and look at what's happening in the industry or in the world, and think about not 10 years in the future, that's too far right now, but like 2 to 3 years out, where do you see the movement going? What new uses does it have, and relevancy does it have moving forward? How does it change and adapt as well? Any other last comments you want to make as we close out here?
Well, I think I'll just close by saying, you know, I think we'll have a handful of very different cities who manage the public realm and transportation and public space differently. I think we'll have a lot of cities who try to revert back to whatever the normal used to be. And I think the real difference, you know, the delta there is going to be leadership. And a lot of the cities that are going to kind of transform into the most climate ready or resilient, or the economy will turn back on fastest, these are going to be the cities that have the political leadership to do that, and then have the political will of the people behind them to innovate at this time. A lot of cities don't have that, and they don't have it now, and they won't have it in 3 years. But many will. Hopefully, you know, a majority will, but it remains to be seen. But I think without that key ingredient, you won't see the cones and the MUTCD signs become, you know, landscaping and car-free, car-light streets, or whatever the vision might be. You know, it's just not. It takes a real push from leaders. So,
well, and hopefully, what this experience is creating is an environment where a whole new crop of leaders is emerging out of it.
One hopes.
Seeing this at scale happening around the country and around the world, that will open people's eyes to a whole new realm of possibility that maybe they didn't previously appreciate. Well, Mike, go ahead.
I think we're going to see more and more doctors running for office. I think we also might see restaurateurs or bartenders jumping in.
Or joining planning commission or doing other things.
Because I think, as Joe said, they're all becoming very smart and very familiar with the process of public space, and who it's for and who it should be for, and how it should be equally apportioned. It'll be interesting.
I agree. So yay for more diversity in terms of our leadership. We've always needed more of that, and looks like we have a chance to really put that in play.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Mike, for your time. Just to wrap up for our audience, just a few housekeeping things. This recording and all of our other episodes are available online for you to look at. Join us again next week. We'll be joined by the three of our mutual friends, Tommy Picello from the Memphis Medical District Collaborative, who will be sharing his insights and experience as one of those district managers who's managing both an innovation district and a health district. Two things that are going to be really relevant moving forward. So join us this time next week, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Take care.
Good work.